Every fighter needs a cause. Every cause needs a fighter. The Sumud Podcast is sponsored by The Karate Attorney, fighting for justice inside and outside the courtroom. Visit karateattorney.com or follow on Instagram at karateattorney to learn more.
The moment that we're in with an act of genocide, we as a community are in deep hurt. We're in deep pain. We're mourning. And I think it's got to come out. You end up hurting people inadvertently. You hurt people who are part of the broader strategy of getting the truth out there and doing journalism in an ethical way. You need all of the people in collaboration chipping away at the fact that there is a genocide happening, being reported on in a very unethical and frankly racist way.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud.
Visit sumudpod.com to subscribe and connect with us on social media. You can also support our work by contributing monthly on the Support Us page. Even $10 a month helps us continue amplifying Palestinian voices and those in solidarity. Thank you.
On this episode of the Sumud Podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify Aymann Ismail. Aymann is a journalist, storyteller, and father. Born to Egyptian immigrants in New Jersey, he grew up between worlds after 9/11. Through his reporting, film, and memoir, Becoming Baba, he turns identity into art, confronting bias with honesty and finding meaning in faith, fatherhood, and belonging. Welcome to the podcast, Aymann.
Thanks for having me, Ed. Really appreciate it.
I just really wanted to kick off with, you have such vivid memories of 9/11 and your experiences around there. And I was hoping, just not only as a journalist, just as a person in general, if you could juxtapose that 9/11 experience with what you're seeing now with the anti-Palestinian racism.
Yeah, so I was about 11 years old, just turned 11 when 9/11 happened. I was attending an Islamic school here in New Jersey called Al-Ghazali. Shout out to all my Al-Ghazali peers. It was in Teaneck, New Jersey, so right across the water. And I also grew up in Newark, New Jersey. And so seeing the Twin Towers was a daily part of life. And so when the towers were attacked that day, a lot of people I knew, myself included, had parents who worked in New York City. My dad was a taxi cab driver. And so he was driving up and down Manhattan all day long. And so the first thing I felt was, oh my God, it's my dad alive. It felt like it was an attack on us specifically, being in the Newark, New Jersey area. And so the school was canceled. Everybody got let out, not because of what happened, but because there was a protest that assembled outside. And I remember looking out the window before we'd even known anything was happening. And we saw maybe 12, 15 people outside picking up stones and throwing it at the school. And, you're 11, you're 12, you almost want to go outside and confront them. You feel invincible. And so a bunch of my friends were going to do that. But by the time we got outside, there was so many more people. And the teachers were frantically trying to get the students onto the buses to evacuate us out of the school. And so our experience of 9/11, it was almost like there was 3 different experiences happening all at the same time. One, as people in this area, we felt like we were under attack. The second one was as people who were Arab and Muslim, and visibly Arab and Muslim, we felt like we were also under attack by our neighbors. And the third, there was this clash where we almost didn't know the space that we were in anymore. It almost felt like we went from being American kids or Muslim kids who were American to being you have to choose one or the other. And what I think what made this experience so formidable, I think, for me at that time was the fact that my mom had to go to work the next day and the day after because she worked at a different Islamic school. And she didn't know what to do because the school didn't open up. And so she did what she didn't want to do, which was she took me out of the Islamic school, put me in public school. So you could just imagine for a minute what it was like. September 11th happens. The school year's already started. Early on in the next week, there's a new student in your class, and his name is Aymann Ismail. And it's the first Muslim kid you've ever met. And it's the first Arab kid you've ever met. And so I was anxious because I was like, how am I going to explain to these kids that I'm not dangerous? You shouldn't have to protest me. I had nothing to do with it. My dad was there. He came home covered in dust. We thought he died. It was that close for us. But luckily, we were in a place like Newark where everybody was black or brown. And so they were just mostly excited about the fact that I was Arab. And they had questions about where I parked my camel and which pyramid I lived in. You know how kids in the city get. They would just like to rib you and tease you. So if I could compare it to this moment now, there was this immediate reaction in our community to like wave the American flag and really try to distinguish ourselves from being associated at all with who was now being framed as like the global enemy number one. And it was tough because you look on the TV and, it's so easy for us to distinguish ourselves from the people who carried out that attack. But at the same time, it was like not up to us whether or not we can identify with them or not. So in our case, we had to do everything we can to try and act like we were wanting to make everybody comfortable. We wanted everybody to feel like it's not us, we're on the same team. And that was sort of weird because we were never like patriotic to begin with. It was sort of weird to have an American flag in a community like ours in Jersey, where if you were from Ecuador, you had an Ecuadorian flag. If you were from Puerto Rico, you were wearing Puerto Rican jerseys every day. We felt the same way about being Egyptian or Palestinian in our community. We just wanted to be normal. That's how it was to be American. But there was that day where all of a sudden everybody had to wave the American flag, and it was almost like a defense mechanism, like we had to. And if I could compare it to today, it's almost like history is repeating itself in the sense where everybody's looking to see which side you're on. They want to know if you're on like team Western civilization or team terrorist. And it comes out in weird ways. For example, I did an interview with CARE New York office shortly after October 7th, and they described to me having to open up a whole new desk just to take in the many requests for help they were getting from healthcare workers and from education instructors and teachers. And the reason why they had to do this was because there was almost like this inquisition happening. If you were wearing a flag pin, if you were wearing a kufaya, if you were wearing anything that could possibly relate to Palestine, it was inevitable that somebody was going to complain about you. And it was almost like the only way they could do that is if they were to say, hey, that person's making me feel unsafe. And I think that is exactly what happened to us after 9/11, where just by being who we were, other people felt empowered to weaponize our own identities against us by pretending and creating this illusion that we were making them unsafe just by being around. And yeah, it almost feels like we handled it a little bit better as a community this time around. I think at that time in 9/11, there wasn't many people saying, no, we have to really show that we're Muslim and we have to really be Arab now more than ever, in the same way that we saw a lot of people do it with the Palestinian movement. But I think the animosity on the other end was pretty much exactly the same.
When you say we were, well, I'm putting words in your mouth, more equipped this time around, it was almost like, you know what, we've seen this movie before. But it was more of your generation specifically saying, I'm assuming you're a young guy, but your generation saying, not this time. We're going to stand up. We know the playbook here.
And I also think it has a lot to do with the internet and TikTok. I'm not on TikTok. I'm not that young. But the idea that we could talk to each other and organize and commiserate and read other people's blog posts or posts on Substack, talking openly about how it feels to experience the moment from the perspective of a Palestinian or from the perspective of someone Arab or Muslim. I think having access to that would have really changed the way we experienced 9/11. Because I think afterwards, all we were getting was media from legacy institutions like MSNBC or CNN or what have you. And all we were getting at that time were exposés like how to tell if your neighbor is a terrorist. What is a sleeper cell? And how is this danger actually going to come to you and attack you or your family at night? We were reading the same stuff. We were seeing the same stuff as our community. One specific moment that was really eye-opening for me, it was immediately after 9/11. I had just gotten home. My sister, she went to the local high school already. So she walked home and we were wanting to know what was happening with our dad. This is before cell phones. So we're looking at the news and we're seeing the big gray cloud of smoke barrel through the narrow streetways and people just running for their lives. And then the shots of people in this dust cloud covered head to toe. That's what we were watching nonstop. But we were doing so as a family because we wanted to know if our dad was there. We wanted to see if we could find our dad in the chaos. And that was our only way of really knowing what was going on. And I think the fact that we consumed that much media of what happened after 9/11 really had an impact on how we felt as a community. It's we really do need to come out and say, hey, this is not us. It almost felt like this is the water cooler conversation that the whole country was having. And we needed to step in and be the voice to say, actually, you can be Arab and Muslim and not sponsor what happened. Whereas now I think it's almost like a choose your own media. There's a million water coolers now. And you could just immediately after what happened on October 7th, go and listen and read from what Palestinians themselves are saying and what they're saying to each other. And as a journalist myself, I felt like it was my responsibility to immediately try to get the counter narrative. And so I ran a few pieces within a week of October 7th, 2023. The first one was with Peter Beinart, who is a very outspoken Jewish ex-Zionist who's now become one of the leading critics of the Israeli state. And he had like a very empathetic take of like, well, I'm Jewish, I'm feeling all these different feelings, but also know the history and the context. So I need to make all of these different things make sense at the same time. So I thought that was really valuable to put out there to show the diversity of thought and the diversity of experience of how Jewish Americans were experiencing the moment. I interviewed a former Knesset member who was Palestinian to talk about what the politics of Israel was actually going to look like and the fact that people were getting arrested for social media posts. I think the fact that we have journalists who are putting all of this out there immediately makes this a whole totally different experience after 9/11, where we were just getting the one piece over and over again, which was, what is Islam? Is it as dangerous as people actually say? And that was the framing, no matter what.
So, I mean, I remember 9/11, everybody was basically trying to run away and hide the artifacts that they were Muslim, whether it be hijab or anything that they're wearing to go to the mosque. But with this time around, it felt like, no, we're going to all grab our kufiyas, we're all going to grab our flags, and we're going to remind people the world did not start on October 7th, right? This whole issue did not start on October 7th. Would you agree that courage was just a little bit different this time around?
This new generation is not here to play. This new generation is not here to play, man. I mean, even as a journalist, from my perspective, I think I'm really considerate and conscious of like the bad faith takes. I almost don't want to put the bait out there so for people to accuse me of bias at all. And so I'm really careful about how I frame things. I'm really like thinking about what's the worst way to read this and acting accordingly. And that's not to say that I'm ever going to like shy away from reporting on something. You could read my bylines. I think my work speaks for itself. But what I will say is that this new generation isn't even thinking about bad faith criticisms. They know it's coming. They aren't afraid of just talking directly to themselves and not looking for the counterbalance narrative like older generation journalists might be doing all the time. So yeah, I think the same thing applies to activists, people who are going to be thinking about what is the right thing to do here that's going to reflect positively 4 or 5 generations down the line. When our great grandkids look back on this period, what role would I have played in this movement? And that's not something I think we were asking ourselves after 9/11, man. After 9/11, we were thinking, how do we survive right now? And I think if that was the case after October 7th, you wouldn't have seen any of these protests. People would have been really afraid to give any credence to the fact that people were happy that civilians were killed. Like we were immediately thinking about that after 9/11. But in this case, activists were like, we have a role to play immediately. We know it's going to come. We know it's already been happening. It's our job now to let the rest of the world know, which I think it's quite something.
Well, to be clear, you're leading the way too with your journalism. I mean, I appreciate some of the humility there, but you are leading the way with thought-provoking pieces that I think they're really waking people up, generally speaking. So we appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Ed.
I really relate to you. I'm much older than you, but I really relate to you. And I have a lot of respect for you because this concept of having multiple identities, Arab, Muslim, American, are we enough of each category? Are we adapting to each category correctly or whatever it may be? I believe my generation, as I was going to school and university or even high school, we internalized the anxiety. We didn't really process it through words. We went through the pain, and I think that pain resulted in anger, right? Or just simply being despondent in general. You found a way that I wouldn't have been able to do. You found a way to talk about it and write about it. Where does that come from?
Like, I feel that too, by the way. Like, I feel that pain. And I know exactly what you're talking about. It does hurt to feel like you have to choose between like disappointing your neighbors or disappointing your parents. I totally know what that's like. Journalism in particular, it could be easy. It could be hard. And that's why when people like are really critical of outlets, I tell them, follow the journalist, not the outlet. Because you could be the kind of journalist who just reads what other people are saying and puts it together and you just put it out there and it is what it is. You could be the other kind of journalist who is going to be on the phone all the time, really challenging people who you love and respect to get to what you think is going to be like the truth behind the truth. And so in that vein, I think the same applies to how we think of ourselves as Arab Americans. Like, you could just call yourself Dominican when you're around your Dominican friends and just hang out, and it will never be an issue. Like, you can do that. And like, I have no issue with people who do that.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot more difficult to try and like get your community to not only tolerate you, but to celebrate you and to understand you and to think of you as exciting to be around. I feel lucky that I grew up in a place like Newark where everybody was from somewhere. And so I didn't ever have to learn how to be both. It just felt like everybody here was both. And so it's just about, if you have it in you and if you have the desire and if you want to do the extra labor and try and weave the two together. But at the same time, it's really hard to do that. It really is. And so I have no qualms, or I don't want to put any pressure on people who have decided to change their name to Mo or to change their name to Sam, because they work in an environment where it's going to be a lot tougher to do that. For our community, it's really easy to set the standard really high, especially right now, and jump down people's throats when they don't meet it perfectly. And I think the reason for that is because we have so many examples of people who are able to do that. Thank God for the internet, you know? But we're also victims of this stuff. We're also hurting. We're also being told in whatever environment that we're in that we should be a different version of ourselves in the other direction. We need both. We need people who can, go by Sam and, excel in like their law firm. We also need the people who are going to go by Samir and do the same in a different law firm. I think all of it is part of who we are as a community, and neither one is more right than the other, honestly. I think we were more generous with each other. That's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, but still, I'm not going to let you off the hook here as the wannabe journalist, right?
I think you are a journalist, man.
Not even close to you. You probably could do this interview better than I could if it were reversed.
I listened to Sumud, man. Honestly, your interview with Mehdi Hasan was like a meeting of two minds. It was really, really sharp.
I appreciate that. I still want to understand what gave you the courage to put pen to paper to write about your dual identity, challenging the narratives within the Muslim community as a Muslim man. Things that you and I know very well that we're not supposed to bring up necessarily or talk about, but you put it on paper. And I'm asking not because of just curiosity, but, I have a son. I want to tell my son, well, This is what Aymann did. You can do it too.
I know what you're saying. Look, it's not like I had to learn to be courageous. I think we all do it in our own ways, which I feel like is such a corny, like Mr. Rogers way of answering that question. Here's what I'll say. I am very privileged as a Muslim man, as a Muslim boy. I have a sister. Could she ever dream of writing a book like I had, like really talking through all of the sins that she had done? No. And I think that responsibility that we have as men to not only fulfill our duties Islamically or culturally, and really hold up the mantle of being a man in our community. We also have a duty to tell the harder stories that I think we are not in a place yet where women could so freely do so. I mean, I know we have a lot of examples of women telling, like Mona El-Tahawi, amazing writer who really goes there. But there are so many examples of women like my sister, high achiever. She went to Harvard Law School and then went to NYU Medical School. She's a real JD-MD for real. Can she ever confront my mom and talk about sinning in a way that I can? I don't really think so, to be honest. And so it almost felt like I have to, because so many people can't. I'm forever going to be my mom's baby boy. And so I know that even when at the very, very beginning, when I was starting my career, and one of the first things I ever did was I did a piece about gay Muslims. I had a cousin who's gay, and I really wanted to tell his story because what happened to him was tragic. His parents, my aunt and uncle, disowned him. And he had to go and live on his own. And he crashed with me for a while. And he really needed to become an adult a lot younger because his parents didn't want to have a gay son. And that was a real thing that happened. And it was happening around the same time as Trump's rise. And so it was in the news. There was already the news peg where people were asking the question, can Trump solve the issue of Islamic homophobia? And so I wanted to do a piece that felt like it was not just reflective of the politics, something that didn't feel like we were going to be reading about who Muslims were or who Arabs were as a political football, but how are they actually experiencing this moment themselves? And so I got in the room. I had 2 cameras. I set up in my cousin's room. And so he had the Quran to his left, and he had this big gay pride flag over his other shoulder. And it was a really wonderful conversation, man. He was talking about how he doesn't feel safe to go home. He doesn't feel like he could be both Muslim and gay and still have his parents accept him. At the same time, this like real problem isn't going to be solved by ostracizing Muslims. And it was a really thoughtful conversation. And my mom got really, really pissed. She was like, Aymann, you really shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff in public. This is going to be used by people who are really eager to show examples of Muslims behaving badly. So you shouldn't be doing this stuff in public. But I was really happy with the way that I was able to put it together, because I think what it did was it took something that was being used against us because we weren't part of the conversation and introduced us into the conversation. Now you had to listen because this was a gay Muslim person who was praying more often than I was. He's a lot more religious than I am, and he's making it work. So you sort of have to listen to him. After that first little bit of success, and I knew if my mom wasn't going to disown me after that, I could still continue to push the envelope. And so I did one about wearing the hijab. I interviewed both my mom and my sister, and I put them in the same space where they were not talking directly to each other, but they were trying to answer the same level of intimate questions at the same time. And I think what that did at that time, again, in a moment where the country was deciding how comfortable are we with hijabs, we were sort of inserting the humanity back in. We weren't going to not be a part of the conversation anymore. And I feel like that really paved the way for the rest of my journalistic career. That was about 10 years ago when I did that stuff. And so now at this stage, I feel like not only is there an audience that's going to consume the crap out of it because it's just the beat less walked, it's doing something necessary for a community that we don't get a chance often enough to do, which is to have the conversation about who Palestinians are, what Islam is, what the role of the Arab nations are in the world, in a way that doesn't forget that we're human and that we aren't just responding to our nationality all the time, that we're not just responding to our religion all the time. I forget who said it, but it was a really awesome quote. It's a lot harder to hate someone up close. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I've sort of been really proud to have been able to do that work. So I don't think it comes from a place of courage. I think it comes from a place of privilege, to be honest.
Okay, let's go back to your cousin. You did a story about being gay and Muslim, right? Let's go back to that for a second. Were you afraid of doing that piece religiously? Were you thinking, oh no, the religious community, this Muslim community specifically, you're going to look down on me because of this? How did you sort of reconcile that?
It's really simple. I'm not a Muslim journalist in the sense where I'm in journalism to serve the interests of the Muslim community. You know what I mean? I'm just a journalist who is also a Muslim. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not interested in telling fluff stories about any community. I think those stories are boring to read, personally. I think it's really obvious when you can tell the reporter is just thinking, how do I tell the world that this person that I'm interviewing is awesome and dope? I think there's a space for that. I, as a reporter, am less interested in it. I want to ask the hard questions. I want everyone to read it to feel like this subject is a lot more complicated than they expected. You know, I sort of credit this to the rise of social media in the sense where a lot of people get the impression that journalism is supposed to simplify things. You're supposed to walk away and feel like you get it and that you could put it into like a 30-second soundbite and you don't need to read the rest. You could read the headline and get the sense of what the story is. I think of journalism as the opposite. I feel like if you go in and you read it and you don't walk away feeling like this is a lot bigger and there's a lot more to the story than you expected, then you didn't create a piece that was that interesting. So for example, when it came to the story about being Muslim and gay, I have my own hangups when it comes to religion. I have my own hangups when it comes to what Islam says about homosexuality or what any religion or culture says about homosexuality. I have my own like preconceived biases. What I want to do with every piece and what I did with that piece is very simple. I want everybody who reads it to not forget that there's people at the center of this story. That's it, you know? And so when we're talking about a policy, I'm always going to try to find the person who's affected by that policy and give them the floor, because that's what we're actually talking about when we're talking about ICE, for example, or if we're talking about like free healthcare, or we're talking about free pre-K or any of these policies, or increasing the budget military spending. Finding the people who are actually affected by this stuff and giving them the floor and letting them talk about it is the point of that whole conversation in the first place. So yeah, I feel like you can't do a story about Islam and homosexuality without talking to a gay Muslim. I just happened to have one who was in my family. And so I felt like it was my responsibility, again, as the boy that my mom could never stop loving because I'm her baby boy. I felt like it was my privilege and my responsibility to tell that story. That was probably best suited to tell that story.
You know, you had that series, Who's Afraid of Aymann?
Yeah.
I watched some of it, and as I was thinking about it, I know there was a Muslim lens really for that whole piece, or that series rather.
Yeah.
But really, as I was watching it and looking at your whole body of work, I was really saying it's really who's afraid of the truth. Because one way or another, you specifically have this way of getting the truth out there in a manner that is not necessarily in your face. It makes the individuals unpack it internally, which I haven't seen others be able to do. You are a phenomenal writer in the way, I mean, I don't know what you are. Journalist doesn't even really describe you. You're almost like a private investigator. You have this ability to really dig deep. So when you do these stories, do you get interested in something specific and say, aha, I want to dig deeper in that? Or did somebody bring something to you as an idea? How do you process all of that?
It's a funny story, actually. So when it came to that particular series, like Trump had just been elected. It was 2016. And there was a lot of restructuring and reorganizing at the Slate newsroom where I was working at the time. Up until that point, I was a video editor in the sense where I was like pulling clips from the internet and remixing them and, you know, sort of aggregating content and doing like a video a day. And it wasn't fulfilling because it didn't feel like real work. Like, who cares if Melania said something that was funny, you know? So I saw like a real opportunity to do what was always like my passion, which was like filmmaking and like really digging into the gear, getting a really nice camera and doing all the video editing and doing graphics. Behind it all, this was my passion. I really just loved the work. And so I saw an opportunity to do something that felt more serialized. And so I put it into like a nice pitch deck. I made a little PowerPoint to like show my editors because everybody was like figuring out like, how do we meet the moment? How do we become a news organization fit for the Trump era? And like, I really love Slate, man. They've been around for a long time, but they really do function like a startup in that they're really ready to like reorganize and give like the next generation an opportunity to take on new roles. So the only question they asked me was like, do you want to be on camera or off camera? And that was it. I felt supported right away. And I didn't want to be on camera because I knew Laura Loomer at the time. I knew about the whole Islamophobia industry. And I had friends who were doing on camera stuff. Like she's a Palestinian media mogul. She does Muslim Girl. And so I was seeing the way that not only was she getting heat from like Islamophobes, and she was ending up on all these websites and they were photoshopping devil horns on her head, but also from the Muslim community who were like really upset with how she wasn't getting everything perfectly right. And so I really didn't want to be exposed to all that. I felt like that would get in the way of the work. But I had a really awesome editor there. His name was John Swansberg, and he called me into the office and he was like, I don't want to push you too much, but I really think that this could be really good if you're on camera walking people through the things. And after that point, I started to think of it like this could be something like an Anthony Bourdain style, not just like showing up and doing interviews, but simulating the learning. And I think that's what Anthony Bourdain really perfected and mastered. What made his show so good was that he was showing up and people were explaining things to him, and you would watch him connect the dots and it would click for him live on camera. You know, and people, if you haven't seen it, watch what he did in Gaza. And I think that's like the perfect example of what I'm talking about. No other journalist was doing this, where they were not pretending to be the authority. They were just like, there, like, teach me, show me, how do I understand this? And so I thought like, this could be really good for the Muslim community, where we have somebody who is Muslim, who's going to be asking these big questions about Islamophobia in a way where they want to learn and they want to get it. And so I think that really set the stage for the show, because it felt like every show was going to write itself. If I wanted to do something about like gay Muslims, it just felt like, okay, all I had to do was ask questions that I didn't already have the answer to. And instead of trying to thread things together to make them make sense, I'm just going to experience it. And I'm just going to show up and try to figure things out and learn on camera. After that, it was just a matter of editing it, throwing on some funky graphics, throwing on some like glitch edits, and it all came together, man. I was really lucky to do 15 episodes over the span of 2 years. And after that, I think we just ran out of money because it was kind of expensive to do. I was getting Slate to fly me out to everywhere, man, to like St. Louis, to Texas, so like all over. I can't believe they let me do it for that long. but we're like a media outfit, and you understand because you make this stuff too. It gets expensive really fast. Yeah. I mean, credit to Slate for not only letting me do it, but for paying for all of it,
Was Slate a part of the American Muslims, A History Revealed as well?
No, that was PBS.
PBS. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
And can you just talk about that a little bit?
We had a physical document owned by one of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson's personal copy of the Quran.
Yeah.
And this felt like a huge find. We got PBS on board. And obviously, if you have a name like PBS, you're more likely to have somebody like the director of archives at the Library of Congress to say, yes, sure, you can come take a look. But the level of access we got, I think, is unprecedented. I mean, I've been a journalist for a long time. Never in my life have I ever been to the Library of Congress with a team where they have everything laid out for you on dollies. And they're just like, here, sure, here, take a look. Film this, film that. What can we do for you? This documentary, I think, is the first and only time we're ever going to be able to do something like this as a community, where we could tell our story for ourselves from inside the deepest seats of power in America. It's really, really, really dope. If you haven't seen it, you really should. So we did one about the Thomas Jefferson Quran. We did one about Yarrow, who was the only person who was enslaved that had been freed, to have also had their portrait made by somebody who used to do presidential portraits. So this person will do George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and then he also did someone who was a freed enslaved person named Yarrow, who was also a Muslim, a devout Muslim. And so this person who was a presidential painter, this is like a rock star in this era, man. This is like one of the most important people walking around doing this stuff, writing in his diary how blown away and impressed he was by this Muslim person who would interrupt the interview and get up to pray, and who lived for like over 100 years. And when he asked him, was like, how did you live for so long? He was like, well, I didn't eat pork or drink alcohol, So this is all part of like the very earliest days of America. And so now when we're having this conversation of like, what does Islam in America look like? How amazing is it that we have like evidence of this guy named Yarrow, who they named a whole town after, by the way. There's a place called Yarrowsburg. He was an enslaved person who made it to this like level in America to have a town named after him, who was a Muslim, who impressed people by the way he was able to maintain his spirituality after surviving enslavement, brought here against his will. Incredible stories, man. It's just like the wealth of knowledge that we were able to uncover for this project is really next to none, I got to say.
Do you know what it means to the community that you're creating this content for future generations? I mean, do you realize how badass that is?
Not really. I feel like this next generation is doing so much better work. I mean, I'm being so real. Like the fact that Zeteo News exists, the fact that DropSite exists, the fact that Sumud Podcast exists. This is, I think, where the real stuff that is being made, man. And places like Slate Magazine, it's really great that we have this interface with the rest of the country. But I think compared to what all of these independent news organizations, and I think of Sumud as a news organization, what you guys are doing, I think, is really about teaching the next generation to be their full selves. So I think of my role more as like, how are we going to tell the national story if we're going to try to compress our identity into one face? What's the best way that we could do that? Whereas I think what we're doing as Zeteo and we're doing with Sumud is, I think, speaking directly to the next generation and telling them, here's what we're building. How are you going to build on top of that? You know what I mean?
You're encouraging the next generation to build these media companies to create these outlets. One of your most brilliant pieces, you did this piece on the store that called the cops on George Floyd. I've read it now 5 times, and I read it even before this interview. Okay.
Whoa.
I'm going to let you tell the audience about the
I'm
article.
nervous.
No. Don't be nervous. The one thing that just struck me was the Black community and the Palestinian community have been joint at the hips. We are one. We are in the same struggle. We are fighting for rights and for freedom.
Absolutely.
Yet it was the Palestinians who owned the store. It was a young Black teenager that called the police on George Floyd. Mm-hmm. You don't mind if I cuss to you, right? Like, what a mind fuck. I'm sure it dawned upon you that, okay, these are Palestinians, and okay, that's a Black teenager calling the police on George Floyd. But did it ever really hit anybody that what George Floyd went through is what Palestinians always go through? And to an extent, You could say it was the fault of the store owners or the worker, whatever it may be, that caused that.
I think totally agree that the fates of Black Americans and Palestinians are intertwined. I think the root of oppression comes from the top down, and there's like no reason why the NYPD, for example, should have an office in Tel Aviv except for learning how to oppress people and how to do what they call riot control or crowd control. And we know the tactics, and it's familiar, especially if you grew up like I had, just like constantly consuming media that was coming out of Palestine. We've seen tons of little kids with knees on their necks. We've seen it all the time. There's that famous video from very far away, Israeli soldiers with a stone trying to break the kneecaps of a young kid. And the one thing that always glared out to me was there was a group of a lot of soldiers, and they were all standing around, either watching, like keeping guard, and one of them had their knee on this kid's neck. And so it's so easy, I think, to connect the dots between that video and what happened to George Floyd. It's the same thing. It's the same thing, man. What made that story interesting is, like you said, that store was owned by a Palestinian family. There was a mosque in the basement. And so that's where people in the neighborhood would congregate to go pray. It's also a food desert. And so a lot of people locally would go buy groceries there. And so the story was going to be a lot more complicated than you would expect immediately just from walking in. You see like the pictures of people's kids on the glass. You know, I go to bodegas all the time. I'm in New Jersey. I used to live in New York. I never see like pictures of the community's kids on the walls. I've never heard of a store saying, you know what, if you get straight A's, you can grab whatever you want in your hand. You know what I mean? But that was that kind of spot. At the same time, they were at the center of what was going to be like one of the largest flashpoints in like the BLM movement. I think at that point when I'd gone there, it was probably like close to a year after George Floyd had been killed. And there wasn't like much said about the store except for the fact that this store called the cops. And before I even knew they were Palestinian, I was like, there's got to be more to this story. I didn't know that they were Palestinian until I started researching it. And then I called them up on the phone, and to my surprise, the guy who owns the store just picks up. He's like, Cup Foods, what's up? And so I'll just tell him, I'll be like, yeah, I'm interested in showing up and doing an interview. They're really careful because they don't want the wrong kind of attention, because it's really easy to say this store did call the cops on him. The reason why George Floyd died was because of this store. I showed to some of my work and I was like, look, I'm trying to get like the long form story here. I want to know what really is happening. I want to uncover all of the dynamics. And so he was like, whatever. And he hangs up. And so I show up, I get on a plane. I convince my editors this is a good story. They were just as excited about it as I was. Slate, I cannot credit them enough for making this story happen. I get on a plane. I find out that my friend lives like a block away. So I'm like, yo, let me crash for you. Save some money on a hotel, and I want to be in like close to the source of action as possible. They're like, bet. So I stay with them for a couple of days, and I just hang around the store. I like don't leave, to the point where they joke around about like, we got to get this guy like a security shirt because he's just standing around like this the whole time, like not moving. And I think like that expression of dedication made them feel safe to be like, okay, this isn't just another one of those reporters who wants to get the quote for their piece and then move on. And so that's when they sat down, like the third or fourth day. They're like, okay, let's talk. And we did like an hour-long interview with each of the brothers, the Palestinian brothers who owns the store. And one of them wasn't even in town, and they called him up and they're like, you got to come talk to this guy. And I think after the way that I conducted the interviews, which was mostly just listening, honestly, that's another thing about my reporting that I'm happy to talk about, which is like how if you over-prepare, you lose that curiosity in your piece. And I think the curiosity has got to stay at the center of the piece or you're going to lose the reader. Very like Allah Yarhamu, Anthony Bourdain taught me that. Okay. So I only had like 3 questions written down. And the rest of the time I'm just asking follow-ups. So we'll talk about how like my son is Black. Like it's really hurtful for people to call me racist. I have a Black wife and my son is Black. Like this is hurtful. And I'll ask them like what, how did that interaction go? And I'll just go where they want to go. And it just makes the story much more rich. And so by the end of it, they had been really careful not to reveal the identity of the person who actually picked up the phone and made the 911 call. And yeah, they were like, look, be really careful. This guy is like really going through it. We trust you to keep his identity safe. We're worried that if people find out who he is, he's going to get doxxed and it's going to be really dangerous for him to be around. He comes back to the store, stone-faced. This kid is like 16, 17 years old. He's a teenager. He had just arrived from Africa. He was from West Africa. And I mean, nothing prepares you as a journalist for a little kid, a teenager, to sit across from you and be like, I wish I died. I feel like I killed George Floyd. You know, he's like, I just got here. I didn't know that the cops do this to Black people. He was like, where I'm from, we call the cops if we have a problem, and the cops come and they sort it out. And so he was like, you know, Muslim kid. And he kept on like every once in a while being like, Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel, which as Arabic speaking people, that's like a thing you say when you feel devastated. And yeah, I had no questions. I just let him talk. And every time I felt like there was an uncomfortable silence, like I had to say something, he would just keep going. Yeah, still one of the most difficult interviews I've ever had to do. 16 years old, and he's got to live with that for the rest of his life.
I have to think that the Aymann going into that interview or those interviews and that research is different than the Aymann coming out of it. Did you feel a change within yourself as a person, as a journalist?
No, I don't think I felt like changed. After the interview was done and I like took my notes and I called my editor and I was like, here's what I got. No, I don't think I was like moved, because this is what we do every day, man. Journalism is tough. Like I said, it can be tough. It can be easy. I prefer to do the tough version where you are in the room, boots on the ground, talking to people face to face. As often as I can, I'm going to be in person to do these interviews because you get that texture. Here's what I'll say. Like, I did another interview that was about equally devastating after Wadi al-Fayoum, who was the 6-year-old child who was stabbed to death shortly after October 7th. I think he died on like October 10th. He was Palestinian American. He was like in the suburb of Chicago and what they call Little Palestine over there. And to this day, I'm still the only journalist to have interviewed his parents. And I don't think that's for lack of trying. I just think people, when they're talking about it, don't think, oh, well, how are the parents going to move on from this? They're just thinking, what does this mean for immigration? What does this mean for right-wing media? They're thinking about these big, like, broader stuff. And I think as journalists, we really shouldn't forget about the people that have to live with this stuff. And so, yeah, I talked to the mom. You know, she's Palestinian, born in Palestine. And she still had bandages on her faces because she was also stabbed by this guy who killed her son. You know, and I think as a journalist, you want to be in those situations. The goal is to be in the same room with these people and have them trust you enough to give you the story as they experience it or as they feel it, so that you can then do your best to relay it to the world in a way that feels as real and tangible as the experience you had with them. So no, man, it's not like I was moved and activated and I'm like, I'm going to go tell the truth. No, this is the point. This is why we get into journalism. This is the reason, I think, why Allah gave us these experiences with having been wronged in media, so that we can be a generation of Arab and Muslim journalists who aren't going to be falling into the same trappings when we tell our own stories or when we tell the stories of others.
Absolutely. Speaking of that, just generally speaking, can you talk a little bit about media bias?
Would love to, man. Yeah, media bias is such a funny thing to talk about with people, especially when they challenge like certain articles that are written because they're saying, no, that's biased. No, this is biased. You got to read this. This is unbiased. There's no such thing as unbiased. What you're saying is, if something is unbiased, it has no root in experience. There's nothing that the reporter experienced that's in this piece. And so it doesn't make any sense to me. I think as journalists, we ought to embrace our biases, not only so that we can confront them and try to work against them, but also so that we can think about the stories that we are more equipped to tell than others. I don't think like I should be writing a story about Russian prisoners in Serbia. I don't speak the language. I don't have like any direct experience with it. I don't think I could tell a story as good as somebody who is Russian, who, you know, might have some connections to Serbia. And I think the same thing goes for our community here. Like, I happen to be able to speak Arabic fairly well, not great, but fairly well, to hold enough conversation and do an interview in Arabic. And so I have a special privilege to tell the kind of story like going and speaking to the parents of Wadi al-Fayoum. Like, I could tell that story better than Anderson Cooper. I just can't, because Anderson Cooper is not as equipped as I am with my biases and my experience. Does that mean that you should only read pieces where the people are telling their own stories about themselves? No, because I would never in a million years advocate for somebody who's in the IDF to write a report about war crimes committed by the IDF. It wouldn't make any sense. So I think what we need to reckon and be above table and deliberate about how we manage our biases. And I think the reader needs to be kind of caught up to it, man. It's like there's no such thing as being unbiased. And if you go to the drop site, if you listen to the Sumud podcast, if you read any of my reporting, I'm going to be upfront about my biases. I just finished writing a piece about going to ArabCon, where we met, which was really cool. And so I'm writing about my experience as an Arab person, doing these interviews with Cenk, doing interviews with Hani, who runs the Gaza Soup Kitchen. I think being upfront with your experience and talking about what I was expecting and how it actually turned out and how funny it is that there was like these smaller, like weird things happening with like Laura Loomer, like saying like jihad capital. And you know what I mean? Like all of these things are texture that are part of the piece. I don't think as an audience, we should be looking for the piece that is absent of all of that. You can go read anything on the AP or Reuters and think this is as least biased as it gets, which might be true, but it's still not unbiased. Everything from the tenor of the piece, everything from who you choose to interview, whether you're going to use like passive or active vocabulary, all of this is biased. So there's no such thing as being unbiased, frankly. I do think there's like a broad awakening to like bias in the newsroom, especially after October 7th, the way that reporters were writing about what happened on October 7th, the adjectives that they would use, like barbaric, heinous, and how those words aren't used for anything that's happened in Gaza ever since. I don't think I've ever seen any report anywhere in any of these like large institutions where they talk about what happened to Hind Rajab as barbaric or heinous or monstrous or any of these other words. That doesn't mean that those reports are not valuable. It just means that we need to be smart about how we consume our media. One more thing that I think is really important. Arab journalists in particular, and I'm going to put on my AMEJA hat on. The AMEJA is the Arab and Middle Eastern Journalists Association.
Which, by the way, I have to call you Mr. President. I'm sorry, Mr.
Thank
President.
you. Thank you. Yep. My suit is in the cleaners. So there are a couple things that happen when like you are doing a story and there's this idea of bias sitting in the room with you. And if you're an Arab person, this might come about in a couple different ways. And we know this because we did a survey and we asked our members, who are, for the most part, Arab and Middle Eastern journalists based in the US. And we asked them questions like, do you feel your reporting on the MENA region is held to a higher standard of neutrality or balance? So we're essentially asking them, do we feel like there is a perception of bias being held over your head? And almost everybody said yes. 85% of Arab journalists who work in US newsrooms feel like their reporting on the MENA region is held to a higher standard because of who they are. This is a crisis. This is a crisis of what's happening for Arab journalists, man. And so I think this can have a few different effects. On the one hand, you might not want to report about what's happening in Gaza. And if you do, you might want to be really soft and gentle. And maybe you do want to include like the IDF talking points just so that you can prove to your editors that you aren't biased. It could be that you have 4 or 5, 6 editors who you don't work with now looking at your piece because they want to make sure that as an Arab journalist, you aren't biased, something that doesn't happen to other communities. So I think as, if you're an Arab person or a Muslim person listening, this crisis should tell you that the people who are Arab and who are trying to report on this stuff are going through their own world of feelings and they need our support now more than ever. And that's why I highly recommend you subscribe to Zateo or to Dropsite or any of these Substacks to Sumud and support these people, especially legacy newspapers and magazines. You could have an Arab person in the newsroom. They're still not going to be a part of the decision-making until they're at the very top, especially what's happening with CBS and how Barry Weiss, who calls herself a Zionist extremist, being in charge of one of the largest legacy news organizations in the world. We still have Arab journalists and Muslim journalists in these spaces. We need to protect them. We need to not forget about them when we're choosing to boycott the organization or whatever. That's almost not enough. We need to be like clicking on these articles and showing the editors that there's a market for this stuff. You're going to get rewarded with viewership and ad buys or maybe even subscriptions if you are doing reporting about what actually happened to Hind Rajab, which Zateo really, really did an awesome job of covering. I think of our eyes and viewership as currency. just clicking on something. Think of it as putting $1 in someone's pocket. And I think you know this too, as somebody who runs Sumud. Like, just listening to this podcast, it has to be part of your activism.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I want to ask you a tough question.
Let's do it.
And maybe you can help me navigate this. You mentioned Zateo, you mentioned a couple of other outlets, but within the community, even within the Palestinian community, I would say for me, well, that person is really not pro-Palestinian, or that person has said this or that in the past, or whatever it may be. But these organizations are doing good work, but there's always that but at the end, right? Or there is a thing where, you shouldn't support them at all. You should keep it in-house kind of thing. How do you respond to that?
I fucking hate it, man. Oh, dude, it's the worst. It's the worst, but it's also like understandable. I mean, the moment that we're in with an active genocide is just, you can't deny that this pain is being felt even by people who are nowhere near the chaos. We are a community, and by we, I mean anybody who is conscious to what's happening over there in Palestine. We as a community are in deep hurt. We're in deep pain. We're mourning. And I think it's got to come out. And it might come out like we saw at ArabCon, where, there was this question from somebody who I really respect. And it was a good question of like, why are you not perfect? I don't know if you remember this moment where like Mehdi Hasan and Bassem Youssef were on stage, and they were saying like, why are you not perfect? Why do you go into these spaces and entertain the question of like, do you condemn Hamas? And I think this question is happening because we're in pain. And I think what tends to happen in these kinds of situations is you end up like hurting people inadvertently. You hurt people who are part of the broader strategy of getting the truth out there and doing journalism in an ethical way. You're hurting those people because you're forgetting the fact that these people are also victims of this paradigm that you're talking about. So you can't, I think, have a movement in which you exclude everybody who isn't perfectly aligned with how you think it should be working or operated or anything like that. Because then what you end up doing is you forget that this is like a multi-pronged approach. You need all of the people in collaboration chipping away at the fact that there is something like a genocide happening, and the way that it's being reported on and talked about is being done in a very unethical and frankly racist way. Like, that is the challenge. And I think if you're just a journalist in general, you should have an aversion to it. And I've done some reporting on this too. And believe me, even if you are a white person from Montana and you want to write about Gaza, you're going to be experiencing exactly what all of us other Arab journalists are experiencing. You're going to be told, look, you got to think about it both sides. You got to balance your reporting with this and that. Well, the IDF denies it, so you need to include that in your reporting. Oh, well, if only 10 people saw it, how do you know that it's true? Which is like a common trope of like discounting Palestinian eyewitnesses entirely. Something that never happens in other conflict zones ever. What we need to not forget is that not everybody has the same role to play, And again, I'm not thinking about it like an activist of like, how do we tear down the bourgeoisie, or how do we, rewrite the social hierarchy of media? I'm thinking about it like a basic level. How do we get to baseline? How do we get people to stop being racist when talking about Palestine, which is a universal movement? And I think of myself as part of that movement. I think of Mehdi Hasan as part of that movement. I think of the activist who asked that question as part of that movement. I think of the person who was in the encampment on college campuses as part of that movement. You're part of that movement. The people listening are part of that movement. If you care about the truth, you're part of that movement. You know what I'm saying? So if we get into purity tests, what are we actually doing? We are actually working against ourselves in a way. What we're saying is, you can't be a part of this movement unless XYZ. And I don't think that makes any sense, because you're forgetting the fact that in his own way, Mehdi Hasan is a victim of this paradigm where, we saw what happened to him at MSNBC. He was put in a position where he needed to found Zateo in the first place. Like, you got to be considerate of that when you're asking him questions like, why don't you support Hamas and killing civilians? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's really important, I think, that we stay as organized as the other side, who is working day in and day out to make sure that Palestinians are not seen as people, to make sure that reporting is held to a higher standard of neutrality for Arab journalists. It's not a rhetorical foe. They're very well funded. They have organizations that pretend to be nonprofits like Canary Mission, or this organization called Honest Reporting or UN Watch. I feel like if you're plugged into this movement, you know all of these names. I know, Ed, that you're familiar.
Yeah.
What they don't do is they don't say, well, no, you don't hate Palestinians enough, therefore we're going to exclude you and put you in our targets. No. They work with everybody. And they're really successful in being able to build a movement around like not having purity tests. One thing I think that was really smart that I've heard from somebody I interviewed, mind you, I interviewed this person at the RNC, the Republican National Convention, and he's a Republican and he's young. And what he told me was this. He said, the Democrats want to fall in love. The Republicans want to fall in line. And I think if we keep that at the tops of our heads and we understand like, okay, we want to fall in love with Zohran, cool. Does that mean that we shouldn't support him because he didn't go far enough in this one interview or whatever? At a certain point, we have to think about our role and his role and accept the fact that they're going to be different.
Well, speaking of the movement, two things I want to say. First of all, earlier, I have twin daughters and they were acting a fool. So I just pulled up your book to show the face. I said, I'm just going to show this face from now on anytime you all are smart asses with me. Amazing picture. Your book, from what I heard, you had a lot of fans with Israeli flags show up at one of your events and cheering you on and supporting you. Could you first talk about that and talk about your brilliant book, which I am about halfway through now?
That's amazing, man. How old are your daughters?
They are 9 years old.
Wow. Yeah. Mashallah. That's incredible, man. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I love my fans, no matter what flags they bring. So the book came out on July 8th. It was a double day. Alhamdulillah, one of the biggest publishers in the world. The first real stop on my book tour was going to be in Boston. I was excited. My sister, she went to Harvard, so I spent a lot of time in Boston. It was at a bookstore that I'd been to a long time ago when she was a student at Harvard. So I was excited to go back to that bookstore. The publishers and editors who were organizing that stuff, they're like, oh, cool indie bookstore, great spot, cool, got on the phone, we did it. I got an email when I got on the plane. And the email says, by the way, the situation has escalated a little bit. And we want to make sure that you feel safe and comfortable and you have an opportunity to back out if you want to. And I'm like, what situation? Like, what is going on? And they told me that there had been organized protests. They were going to organize a protest on Facebook. And this group that was like, Stop Anti-Semitism in Brookline, which is the neighborhood, is organizing a protest to cancel your book talk. And it was going to be primarily because of the person who was going to be speaking with me, Mafez, who is really, really brilliant. You should follow her. She's one of the organizers at the Harvard encampment. I think they saw that name and they got really upset. And then they also saw that I was going to be like an Arab Muslim person. And so they assigned one person in their group to read the book. And in the book, there's like a chapter about Palestine towards the end, about what it's like to be a young father of young kids and see all of what's been happening to the Palestinian children. Even just like when the image comes to mind, you can't help but just be stunned because it's just been awful what's been happening to those kids. But you feel something as a parent. I'd like to think that you feel something even more as a Muslim and Arab parent. I'm Egyptian. I'm not Palestinian, but there's a kinship there. I feel like those are my people. And those kids have the same names as my kids. And they have the same faces and the same kind of curly hair. How do you look at that as a young father and not feel sick to your stomach and immediately imagine your own kids going through the same thing? It's disgusting. So I wrote about it in the book. I insisted that we delay it so that I have time to write this in. And double day, again, they were like, cool, sounds great, sounds important, let's do it. To their credit. So I show up. I'm not sure what to expect. I didn't see anything except for that email. And I'm like, of course, we're still going to show up. I'm on the plane. We're going to do this. I'm not afraid of anything. It's fine. So we show up and the bookstore was like really on edge. They had hired guards to be at the front. They'd also brought on Jewish Voices for Peace, JVP, peacemakers. They were just going to wear like orange vests and, just form like human barriers between protesters and people who just want to go and enjoy the book launch. And even at that point, I'm like, what exactly, are you sure this protest is going to happen? Like, I'm not Palestinian. This is not a book that's like a polemic about like, here's everything that's wrong with Israel. This is a book about parenthood. It's a book about being a human person who's also Muslim and Arab, who's growing up in America, who's having to reckon with the fact that they were imperfect at all of the stages in their lives. And now that they become a parent, they feel like they need to be perfect. And how do you reconcile all of those moving parts together? That's the reason why the book exists. And so that's what I'm thinking is like, how can you protest that? This is just a book about humanity. And then the first protester shows up, and then the second, and then the third. And then before I even noticed, there's like 9 or 10 people, all of the biggest Israeli flags I've ever seen. It felt like soccer hooligans, you know, like the big Barcelona flags. And immediately I'm like, I'm going to go out and talk to them because I'm like, what is the deal? Like, what are they actually here for? And the first protester I speak with, he's the one who organized it all. And I read in the email that this person was involved in a shooting at the last protest that he organized. And so they need to be really careful with him because he might be armed. But I'm like, let me just talk to you. Like, what is the deal? And so I go and introduce myself, and he's like, I know who you are. This is the author. And he like tells everybody, this is the guy who wrote the book that we're protesting. And he goes, we're not actually protesting. We're here to keep the peace. We're here to signal to the rest of the Jewish community here that we're here in numbers, and we're going to make sure that nothing bad happens to the Jewish community while you're here. And I'm like, this is next level gaslighting. Like, you showed up with big flags to a book launch event, and you're saying that this is like an exercise in keeping the peace. So I interview him, and I just sort of like listen and give him a platform to like speak to state his piece. He's like not Jewish, he's a US veteran. And he talked about all of what he experienced with radical Islam, not Islam, radical Islam in the Middle East. And he talked about how he feels like he needs to stand up for his Jewish brothers and sisters because there was like an attack on a kosher deli in this neighborhood like a month before I showed up. And that, you know, they've been insisting that they stop having so many like pro-Palestine speakers and to like come and do events here. And they've been wanting them to like stock books in their window from like Alan Dershowitz as a show of balance. Because if they're going to have Hala Elian, one of the most talented writers, never mind the fact that she's like, you know, Palestinian, just one of the most talented writers, period. If they're going to have a book by her and Mustafa Butaha, they're going to need to balance it by having a book by Alan Dershowitz. So they've been sort of beefing with the store. And they're like, could you believe that they let them wear kufiyas after this hate crime against this Jewish deli? And so it just became immediately clear to me that I like stepped into like this bigger narrative that I had been totally disconnected from. And so I wanted to like let them know that I cared and I wanted to get the full story. And I'm not just a rhetorical Arab guy who wrote up a chapter that was pro-Palestine, just like pro-human babies. You know, just the fact that I wrote that in there, which they assigned somebody to read. And when they found it, they're like, oh no, we got to protest this guy. And that you might actually feel threatened because there was a kosher deli that had their window smashed in. And so I think just like talking to them really disarmed them. And I think after like I did my interviews, they were a little dumbfounded. They were just sort of like standing around with their flags, not knowing what they were doing anymore. They were just sort of like, well, we're here, so we're just going to keep protesting.
Just so you know, though, it's funny because you're the last person that somebody should protest because you are going to go out there and have a conversation. Like, hey, guys, what's going on? Let's talk about it, right?
I don't want to also like make excuses for them because they are racist. They're getting triggered by the presence of a person who they deem to be the wrong ethnicity. Like that's actually what's happening. And I wrote a piece about it and I made clear that this was about enforcing a hierarchy. This was about saying, no, you need to prioritize our pain. Even though all of what's happening in Palestine is awful, we need to still center and prioritize our pain at a bookstore in our neighborhood. Like that's what it was all about. And I got a quote from the guy who organized the protest that was essentially saying something like, there's something rotten with Palestinian culture. And I asked him, I was like, that's racist what you just said. Like, don't you like realize that? And of course they don't. So they're like, no, that's not racist. Like, I've actually been there and I know, you know what I mean? And it's like, okay, sure, buddy. A whole culture is racist, but you're not the one racist for saying that. Anyways, the actual book talk goes on without a hitch. We were sold out, standing room only. After I wrote the piece, many people were lining up to say, no, we got to support this bookstore because I laid out like the broader conflict that this bookstore was having, this independent bookstore that's owned by Jewish people, that's this broader conflict that the store is having, just trying to stock books written by Palestinians, which I spoke to the owners about. And they're like, look, we did try to get Alan Dershowitz books in here. Nobody buys them. He's like, people want to know about the Palestinian perspective. We're just doing what's good for business. And so ever since I wrote that out, people have been supportive. They've been showing up in numbers to purchase books by Palestinian writers, to purchase my book, and to show the bookstore that even if people aren't showing up to protest this like movement of people who are just anti-Palestine, who are just racist, that they still exist and they're ready to vote with their dollars. This did a lot more to validate the bookstore in selling those books or in inviting somebody like me to speak than it did for their movement. And that's, I think, like good for everybody.
I love the title of the book, Becoming Baba, Fatherhood, Faith, and Finding Meaning in America. Again, I love the image on it. Can you just talk a little bit about the motivation? And for the audience too, first of all, let's just do this for you, if you're okay with it. First 10 emails that we get requesting a book, we will send you a free copy of Aymann's book.
That's amazing, man. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. What is the 2 to 3 main takeaways that you would want the audience to walk away with?
Becoming Baba was a working title. I wanted to kind of like be funny and unserious. I thought about calling it Baby Got Baba, but I was like, it does feel like it should feel real and serious. Because the themes of the book are about love. It's about falling in love with who you've become as you grow up. It's about like separating your life into chapters before you become a dad and then after you become a dad. And as you know, as a parent, it's a whole different version of yourself. And so it's about letting go of who you used to be. Your whole life changes when you become a dad. And so I had read a couple books about parenthood. I think none of them really nailed down like the unique experience of becoming a Muslim Arab dad, because it is a very unique and specific experience. And there's also like different kinds of like memoirs about becoming a parent. And I get that we need them. No shame and no knocking anybody who wrote this book. But I didn't want to write the kind of book that was about like, here's all the ways that my immigrant parents got it wrong. I didn't want to write a book that felt like a trauma dump that was like just shitting all over our parents who, against all odds, were able to raise us. You know, they did so much to like try to keep Islam and Arabic culture alive in us, to the point where now, and I think you could probably relate to this, it's muscle memory. We can't help but be the way we are because of how they raised us. And now that we're both parents, we know it wasn't by accident. This was all done on purpose. And so I wanted to write a book about my relationship to my parents and then how that relationship changed when I became a dad. And it's sort of like, you know, it's sort of funny. We all heard the phrase, like, you'll understand when you become a parent. It's kind of true, you know? Yeah, so this book is about a celebration of what it means to be Arab and Muslim in America. It's not a dump. It's not about like how awful it was. It's actually about all of the ways it became like a superpower for me in my life and all of the ways that I've learned to be a better person because of my experiences as a Muslim and Arab American. And it's also about coming into the knowledge of my own parents and learning to understand that my parents put me in Islamic school for a reason, and that they spoke to me in Arabic so much at home for a reason, and that why they like forced me to sit down and like read the Quran for a reason. You know, they were doing something there. They weren't just trying to torture me or make me feel like I can't play when I'm home. And even though that's how it felt, like I'd much rather go like out play basketball with my friends or whatever I wanted to do. And I resisted it so much because I was becoming a teenager and I didn't see the value in it. I wasn't asking big questions about what does God want me to be. I was asking, how do I get this girl to like me back? You know, those are the questions you're asking as a kid. And so it wasn't until I became a dad and I'm like thinking, oh my God, how do I raise a Muslim kid? How do I raise a kid who feels proud to be Arab? It wasn't until I was asking those questions when I went, oh my God, like my parents are the experts at this. And so the book begins with this scene in which like we're moving and I'm giving my mom a really hard time. And she's just trying to get us out of the ghetto. She's just trying to get us away from Newark, New Jersey. And I'm resistant to it. And I don't see the wisdom of it. And then it rounds out at the end of this chapter where it like flashes forward to when I become a dad. And I'm asking my mom, how did you do this? How did you pull this off? All of your kids went to college. And in an environment where a lot of kids who went to our school didn't go to college. You know, we were in Jersey City and in Newark, New Jersey at the height of the crack epidemic. You know, they did it. They pulled it off. And I asked my mom, how did you do it? How did you raise good Muslim kids? How did you like raise kids who feel proud to be Arab? And she goes, I don't know. I failed. You know, and I think this is like a really important place to start the story because I think, like, what does it mean to have such high ambitions for your kids? And even if you think of them as successes, you still feel like you didn't do enough. And I think that really cuts to the core of who we are as a community. and the bar we set for ourselves when it comes to fearing Allah, for having taqwa, for having belief in rahmah, all of these things that are core to our faith that our parents try to teach us, but it doesn't sink in because we don't need it yet. So it's about falling in love with another Muslim woman who changes the way I think about Islam. This book is about falling in love with my kids, because maybe you relate to this, maybe you don't, but it took me a while. You know, I mean, no, it's true. It's true. I didn't like being a dad right away.
Yeah.
And it's also about coming into the knowledge of your parents and feeling like you have so much to learn from the experience that you had to compartmentalize because you felt like it got in the way of you feeling like your full self your whole life.
Just the creative process really quick of writing the book. Did something happen with your child and then you went and you kept like a notepad and you wrote down this idea, or I called my mom at this time, 2:30 a.m. I don't know what to do. Or was it this sort of vacuum experience of putting it all together?
No, I started writing the book after I became a dad. So it's exactly what you said the first time. Here's what happened. You're going to judge me, but I think it's okay. This book is all about like, I'm the villain. Throw all of your anguish and angst at me and just like see how it all sort of formulates in a very human way. So the first thing that happened when we became parents, or when I found out that my wife was going to have a baby, was I started to like study. I started to read the books. I'm a journalist. I went on like my fact fighting mode, and I read all the books, and I read this book called Happiest Baby on the Block. You know, I learned all about the moves and like how do you sway your baby, and I learned about feeding schedules. I learned about like the best way to wipe. I learned about the best fabrics for like cleaning the dribble off of your baby's lip. I wanted to be like the best kind of dad because I felt like if I could do that, I could set my kid up for success, right? I was still in this mentality of my parents didn't do enough. I need to do more. And then the first thing that happens is when we bring the baby home and the baby's like crying because the baby's hungry. We had like a latch issue. I don't know if you could relate to this either, but the baby wasn't latching right away. And so the baby was really, really hungry and the milk wasn't coming right away. And so I wanted to intervene, and I made the bottle of formula, and I'm like, we got to feed this baby right now. This baby is starving. Like, you have to feed this baby. And my wife was like already emotional because she's, you know, struggling with latching. And now she has to deal with this guy, a man who's telling her, raising his voice even, saying, you're starving the baby. Give the baby some food. Why don't you? Please. Like, fear Allah. You have to feed this baby. It's not about the latch. It's about getting food in the tummy. I read this book, and the book said that you have to produce these many wet diapers on the first day. We're already halfway through the day, and we only have one diaper. We're not doing it right. And so my wife cries. She cried. And she goes, like, I don't feel like I can raise this baby with you.
Ugh.
I know. And she was like, this is not what I expected out of you. Like, I don't know how we're going to survive if you're going to be in my ear telling me all the things that I'm doing wrong. And after that moment, and tears started to come down her eyes. And this is like the most emotional day of our lives, man. Like, we'd never fought before that. We were always like best friends, like getting out and doing antics. Like, she used to climb bridges with me, or like at least like go in the tunnels with me. Like, we had that kind of relationship. We were like best friends. And so to see that I was capable of doing that and to make her cry, I was like, whoa. Right after COVID, my COVID activity was like learning to garden because my friend's dad had recently passed, and I really wanted to not squander my opportunity to have a relationship with my dad. And so I got into gardening. He's a Falahi from Fasaid, from Egypt. So he's like from Upper Egypt. And so I got into gardening because I thought this could be something like a way of me having a relationship with my dad. And I wasn't going to plan either. And so I went to go tend my garden. Very basic stuff. Still struggling with that. And it's like, why aren't you growing? Oh, I'm doing everything the book says. Stop. Like, just listen. And then I kind of came back and I came into the space, and my wife had finally figured out the latching, and the baby was eating and the baby was quiet. And it just sort of dawned on me that like I wasn't part of the solution. And actually the solution here was that I needed to leave. And that really revolutionized the way that I thought about my role as a parent. And it really revolutionized the way I thought about my dad as a parent. You know, like sometimes you don't need two parents. Sometimes the better thing for you to do is to walk away and let the other parent handle it. Sometimes the better thing to do is to say, oh, you're struggling with this. Are you hungry? Let me make you a meal. Do you want a sandwich? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
After that experience, I wrote about it for Slate magazine. It was a very hard piece to write, but it felt like there was a lot of emotional relief that I got from writing it. And after that moment, after I had the first draft, I was like, this is a book. Like, I'm going to have so many more experiences like this. And there's also like this other piece that I wrote about how difficult it was to come up with the perfect Muslim name.
Yep.
And how I settled on the name Musa after like this whole process with like spreadsheets and thinking about like how many terrorists on the watch list are named Musa and like what's the probability of this? You know what I mean? Like I went a little crazy. And I was like, all of this feels very specific to our community, and it actually could feel cathartic for me to put it all in one place. But also maybe somewhere, someplace, somebody's going to become a dad and they're going to feel the same things that I felt. And maybe it's going to be helpful to know I'm not alone. So after that first experience with making my wife cry, I started to write the book. And, you know, it wasn't very long after until I made the next mistake, like where we were about to like start feeding my baby. And we were going to give them solid foods for the first time. And I wanted to help. So I learned some recipes. I went on the internet and I was like looking at, again, like fact finding, trying to like approach it as a journalist. And I find these like really easy recipes, but it just said boil the potatoes because I wanted to make mashed potatoes and I never cooked before. Like, again, I'm very much an Egyptian son. Yeah. And you've probably read this because it's the first half of the book. She specifically refused to teach me to cook because she very much expected me to play like the male role and just work and have a wife who's going to do all the cooking. I wasn't thinking about that when I got on the phone, and I was like, oh, this is like a silly opportunity for me to get on the phone with my mom and like ask her, hey, what's the best way to boil a potato? And she got really upset. She was like, where's your wife? Why isn't she boiling the potatoes? Why isn't she making the mashed potatoes? Why are you in the kitchen? And I was like, oh my God, man, this is another one of those ways in which like being an Arab is actually complicating the process of becoming a dad. It's like, I want to do the right thing. But in this case, because I'm an Arab person, doing the quote unquote right thing could actually have this like unforeseen consequence. And now I'm like straining the relationship between my wife and her mother-in-law, you know? Yeah. All of these like weird quirks I felt like were the makings of like a rom-com style book that would be fun to read, that was specific to the Arab Muslim American experience, where there's this like really kind of interesting character who's a journalist who wants to do the right thing, but things keep blowing up in his face. That's sort of the vibe I was going for.
So there's only one thing missing, I think, in the book that maybe you could add like a supplemental material kind of thing, but like the top 10 do's and don'ts, right? Like specifically for Arab and Muslim fathers, the top, you know, because if you would have called me, had I known you, and I've been like, no, walk away, man.
Yeah.
Walk away.
Yeah.
You know, kind of thing. So maybe, you know, put together maybe a quiz even to make sure people are ready.
Ooh, yeah. I like that idea a lot.
Yeah.
Maybe I need to see if becomingbaba.com is available, and I'll check to see if there's like an opportunity here to make a quiz. I like that idea a lot.
So look it up fast because your episode goes live next week probably. So before somebody tries to grab it for you.
You know what? I'll let you know if I do.
Okay.
That actually sounds really cool. I would love to do that. I think the smarter thing would have been to call somebody who's another like Arab dad. At that time, I only knew one or two Arab dads. It was both of my brothers. And I didn't really look up to them in that same way because I still felt like, you know, I just felt like I could do it better. Or I also didn't want to like give them the satisfaction of watching me flounder. Both of my brothers are very much the type to make fun of me for not knowing how to boil a potato. So it almost felt like, yeah, I would love to do like a do's and don'ts. I think maybe you and I could put our heads together and make one.
I probably give you 50 do's or don'ts if you want to do that. Aymann, I've taken up a lot of your time. I appreciate the conversation with you. I look forward to finishing your book. For everybody listening again, email me. First 10, I'll give you a copy, but please go out and get the book. Aymann, I would love, if you're okay with it, come to DC. We'll do part 2. I have so many more questions to ask you specifically about, you know, being a male and being a father and all of the challenges around that people may not really appreciate or understand. So we'd love to have more conversations with you.
That would be such a pleasure, man.
Can I ask you one last question?
Tafaddal.
You go back to 15-year-old Aymann and you want to give him one piece of advice. What would it be?
Why have I never thought of this? I mean, this is Sumud, so I kind of want to give you the radical answer. I will say that my parents were right about everything. Everything. I think 15 years old, especially, is that time where you really want to carve out who you are on your own outside of your family. And I was in the city. And so I was able to just be outside every day, go to New York when I felt like it, skip class when I felt like it, just be out away from my family a lot. And so I think that really gave me the false idea that there was a version of me that was being held back by my parents or being held quiet by my parents. I wish I could go back and tell myself, Aymann, your parents are right about literally everything. Shut up. It's not about you. Go study the Quran. Go get up and pray at Fajr. Don't be lazy. This is something that's going to feel so valuable when you become a parent, and it's your turn to keep this tradition alive. Because there's nothing scarier, I think, that's going to happen to you, even after you climb a bridge and get arrested by the NYPD, even after you get beat up by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, even after you meet the girl of your dreams and ask her for her number and she says no. All of this is going to be nothing compared to the feeling that you're going to have when you look at your little baby and you ask yourself, do you have it in you to teach them to be faithful in America? Nothing's going to be scarier than that. And everything that you learned when you were 15 and before then from your parents is going to become more relevant than ever, more important than your job, more important than your relationships, more important than anything. This is the point of my being right now, my kids, alhamdulillah. So yeah, I would tell them that. And also when it comes to like conspiracies, man, they would blame everything on Israel. And now I'm like, maybe they were right. I mean, it feels like the depths of what we learned about these like false flag attacks and the way that they're just like buying TikTok to like beat the narrative, and the way that they've like bragged about buying politicians. My parents were the type at that time to be like, oh man, like, oh dude, Bill Clinton is like, why is he doing this? They could be like, ask the Israelis. I don't know. It feels like they were really onto something.
I don't think we can end on a better note. I appreciate you, brother.
All right, I'll see you in DC, bro.
All right.
Inshallah.
Listen, stay tuned, cause it's time for Sumud.